Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to another edition of the Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat show here on Hilaal TV. So, what are we talking about on the program today? We're talking about corporal punishment. Just as I say that word corporal punishment, for some people it may bring back very painful memories, very scarring memories, where you were beaten to a pulp, where you were beaten to the point that your confidence was shattered, where you felt that you were no longer worthy, where it created within you a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, and a lot of bitterness. For others, the discussion flows, more humorously. So you will hear from those who were in his class, for example, or even in school back in the day before corporal punishment was legally outlawed, about getting six of the best, about teachers who would sometimes just hit for fun. They would say, "Well, I haven't hit you in a long time. To keep you on the straight and narrow, I need to give you a little bit of a hiding." And then there is this discussion, this debate. Some from the previous generation would say, "Well, we got a good hiding, but we were the better for it. Sure, at times it may have been a bit excessive, but we grew up with discipline. We grew up with respect for our parents, for our teachers. It was the norm at that time, for parents, for teachers, secular education as well as religious education, to use the cane, as they would say." And these days, you would hear many making a very strong argument and saying that, it's not a good way. It's a harmful way of trying to discipline children, of trying to do tarbiyah, of trying to remedy whatever weaknesses or deficiencies they may be therein. Legally, like I said, corporal punishment is not allowed. In the secular environment, where things are more regulated by the state, it's now the incidents of corporal punishment are few and far between, because the consequences are so severe for the teacher, for the administration and the leadership of the school, etc. But within our own community-based organizations, our maktabs, our hifz classes, our madaris, is it still something which is commonly practiced because it's not such a regulated environment? And if so, what are the consequences? And that's why we get into the discussion, because there seems to be complaints coming forth that corporal punishment still takes place and the consequences are still to be dealt with. Now, we have two guests with us on the program today. The first is Sheikh Ismail Londt from Cape Town. He is a well-known alim, qari, the head of the Department of Quranic Affairs at the Muslim Judicial Council. Sheikh, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Moulana Sulaimaan, and assalamu alaikum to all our viewers.
And then we've got Dr. Yusuf Lalkhen, who's an educational psychologist, also with us on the program from Cape Town. Dr. Yusuf, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran for your time and welcome.
Wa alaikum salam, on Ravat and to Sheikh Londt, and it's great to be on the show with you.
Mm-hmm. So, Sheikh Ismail, I'll start with you. You've taken out a series of statements recently on corporal punishment. Tell us what necessitated that, what led you to doing that, and what's the core message there?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man ittaba'a huda. The reality of the fact is that over the past year, since I've been appointed as the head of the Department of Quranic Affairs, I've been trying to put certain activities in place and develop certain portfolios. And I've gone out to institutions to connect with institutions, not to inspect, and to learn more as to what's happening in these institutions and how they are operating and where we could be of assistance. And when people started seeing, because I use social media to create an awareness of the fact that I was going around to visit institutions, I then, over all this time, I received one report, and I had a meeting with the individuals who contacted me regarding this incident about 3 months ago, of corporal punishment, and it drew me back to where we were years ago. Like you said, it was considered part of how things were done. It was the norm of the day. And in the circles that I've recently been moving over the last 10 years, I never heard of it for a while. Maybe I've been living in a bubble, but my position now has drawn attention to the fact that people can turn to someone when they experience something like this. And these parents came to me And so I investigated.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to speak with, I verified the information, went to speak with the individual involved, etc. And then I came to realize that we come from this history where it may have been considered cultural or traditional to a certain extent as part of how we do things. But now the country has changed, the world has changed, and we recognize that even though we have been working independently and we've been given the freedom to do things independently, as citizens of the country, there are certain things we have to comply with. That's number one. And number two, um, the proliferation of Islamic education beyond the hifz. There are many hifz institutions now who are run by scholars who have studied further, and they've come to see via textual evidences that this is not actually the way.
Mm-hmm.
Before, it was merely done as and accepted as part of how things are done. But now people have come to realize. So I realized two things. Number one, we need to create more of an awareness regarding what our deen says in relation to how we educate in general, and especially when it comes to our primary source, which is the Quran. And like you said about people, it cannot be that fear is associated with learning the Quran. It cannot be that there are traumatic experiences, emotional abuse beyond the physical, and mental abuse beyond the physical. It cannot be that is associated with the word of our Creator that we are supposed to love.
Yeah.
So I realized it's about awareness and education and starting a dialogue. So it's been 3 documents thus far, and it all started with corporal punishment part 1, starting a dialogue, and then continuing the dialogue, and then now adding to the dialogue. It was the recent addition. So that's number 1, the awareness. And then number 2, we are starting. I say we. I've contacted a group of experienced scholars and colleagues to put together a manual, a portfolio, a book, a reference of alternative disciplinary measures that can be taken beyond corporal, or to also draw from the experience of our experts. I'm honored to, I'm not sure our paths may have crossed, Dr. Yusuf Lalkhen. Our paths may have crossed, but I've recently been in touch with Habib Kaji, who's also an educational psychologist, and we're sitting together to look at various methods and other methods that can be used in the madrasa space, in the hifz class space, which is different to the academic class, by the way, but which can be used in the madrasa space, in the hifz class space, as options for teachers and ways through which we can bring out the best within our students. So it's about the awareness of what our deen says in relation to corporal punishment. And then number 2, presenting alternatives and options.
Yeah. So, Dr. Yusuf, as an educational psychologist, how would you define corporal punishment? There is a general understanding of what corporal punishment is, but how would you define it? Does it fall into one of the categories of abuse?
Well, let me just say that, as you've pointed out at the beginning, the corporal punishment was abolished quite a while ago. In fact, it was abolished around about 1997. So it almost seems immediately after our democracy, that was one of the first acts that were sort of abolished. And then, of course, subsequent to that, that act informed all the other acts. And so the School Act, for example, of I think 2010 or a bit earlier than that, made it very clear that corporal punishment is prohibited within the educational institutions that fall under the South African Schools Act. But I think subsequent cases that were brought to court with regard to where else corporal punishment may be utilized has made it very clear that corporal punishment is prohibited in all aspects of public life. And so, as Sheikh Ismail Londt said, there's been a proliferation of schools over the last couple of years, not just hifz schools, but independent Islamic schools. And they need to realize that all areas of public life where children are involved are subject to this particular act. So corporal punishment is therefore prohibited across the board. Now, that message may not have come through to many people over the last couple of years, and I'm very happy that Sheikh Ismail is taking the lead in bringing this kind of awareness to our schools, and together with people who are knowledgeable in the area to begin to unpack certain processes that one can put into place. But as far as the notion of corporal punishment, it's actually quite a broad definition. And I think the most immediate one is clearly anything of a physical nature. So any physical infliction of pain or harm or force on the child is considered as a form of corporal punishment. But then one would extend that to other areas of school life, and just simply imposing a lot of pressure on children deliberately and intentionally in order to make them feel bad, or and so on. Those are considered as forms of corporal punishment. But I think for the purpose of tonight's discussion, I think the main one is the one that is currently most evident and most widely used, and that is in fact the physical side of corporal punishment.
Now, when we say physical, right, there would be varying degrees. One is where a person is beaten savagely, there's marks, bones are broken, blood flows, that kind of thing. The other is, and you hear this sometimes from parents or from teachers, it was a tap on the hand, or it was just a twisting of the ear. At a particular age, you can't always, this is the argument being made, that you can't always communicate verbally. Sometimes it's just got to be somewhat physical to draw people into line. It's not meant to cause any physical harm or even emotional harm. From a psychological perspective, is that also harmful? I'm assuming the law may even outlaw that. But from a psychological perspective, what would you say?
Yeah. So look, from a legal perspective, they're very clear as to what constitutes corporal punishment. And they say it is any physical action that hurts a child in the name of discipline. And so that would include the more obvious ones like the hitting and the slapping and the pinching and the pushing, shaking and kicking. All of these are constituted as forms of corporal punishment. But you're quite right. I don't think everybody will necessarily respond to a pull and a push as a form of corporal punishment. And I would imagine I haven't yet heard of a parent who would be offended by that in particular, but they could be. So you have indeed this kind of range of physical action that is utilized in the form of disciplining the child. They all form under this broad umbrella of corporal punishment. And so one has to be very careful. I think that's probably the message tonight that we're going to unpack, that we don't in any way begin to approach a position where we could be accused of corporal punishment, when in fact our intention was not to inflict any harm of a child. So there's that fine line that I think we should be talking about within the institutions, because I think that kind of conversation forms part of the overall notion of school discipline, and what we need to do in order to maintain that discipline and to promote that discipline, and where we need to work from instead from the position of corporal punishment.
All right, we're talking corporal punishment this evening on the program, and our guest, Sheikh Ismail Londt from the MJC's Department of Quranic Affairs, and Dr. Yusuf Lalkhen, an educational psychologist. We take a break. When we come back, we continue the discussion. Welcome back. So we're talking corporal punishment. In the first segment of the program, Sheikh Ismail Londt spoke about what led to him releasing a series of statements in his capacity as the head of the Quranic Affairs Department at the MJC. And we were talking about how corporal punishment is defined with Dr. Yusuf Lalkhen. So Sheikh Ismail, coming back to you, we understand the legal perspective, and Dr. Yusuf has said it was outlawed way back in 97, so like only 25 years ago in South Africa in particular, and globally, probably even before that. However, what's the Islamic perspective? Many times as Muslims, people want to know that the law aside, the legal aspect of it aside, what does the deen say? What does the Sharia say? Because you hear the hadith about using the cane, for example, to discipline a child at the age of 10 if they don't perform their salah, to hit them. What is the Shari perspective on corporal punishment? How do you interpret it? What's your view from a Sharia perspective, and perhaps even the stance of the Quranic Affairs Department at the MJC?
Okay, yes, important question. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Firstly, our religion compels us to comply to the law of the country that we are citizens of. And the law of the country has abolished corporal punishment. That's number one. Before even looking at the Quran, before even looking at the prophetic tradition, our deen compels us to follow the law of the country as long as the law of the country does not prohibit us from implementing our deen. So that's that. But when we're looking at the ahadith, firstly, Quran. When Allah speaks, Jalla Jalaluhu, of Himself in relation to not only having revealed the Quran, but enabled or enabling us to learn the Quran, He refers to Him by the name of Ar-Rahman. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ar-Rahman allama al-Quran. Ay, the All-Merciful, He has taught the Quran. The All-Merciful has taught the Quran. Has taught the Quran, enabled its learning by Jibreel alayhi salam to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the companions, etc. He did not use His name Al-Jalil or any other name of might. Rather, He used the name of All Mercy. And that's a unique application and a unique choice by our Creator Jalla Jalaluhu in relation to not the revelation of the Quran, but the teaching of the Quran. And then when we look at Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he dispatched Mu'adh bin Jabal and Abu Musa al-Ash'ari radiallahu anhuma to Yemen, the narrations say to teach the people in Yemen the Quran and to educate them regarding their deen. He told them, Yassira wa la tu'assira, bashira wa la tunaffira. Make easy for people and do not make things difficult. And spread joy, spread glad tidings, and do not repel people. They were going to represent him there as teachers of the Quran, as educators as far as deen is concerned. And Anas radiallahu anhu said that this was the advice of Rasulullah and instruction of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam whenever he dispatched people to teach deen and to convey the message of deen. And then we have the overarching aspect of mercy. And he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, laysa minna man lam yuwaqqir kabirana wa yarham saghirana. In one of the narrations, he is not of us who does not show respect to our elders and who does not show mercy to our young. He is not of us is a strong statement. Those who do not show respect to the elders and who do not have compassion and show mercy to the young are not of this ummah. So that's our initial stance. Okay? The issue of that hadith that you mentioned, Moulana Sulaimaan, a cane was not mentioned, right? Firstly, in the wording of the hadith. And some, like you said, some use that hadith as a reference or a source for using a cane or hitting students. So if we look at the wording of the hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam addressed the Sahaba and addressed us through them by saying, Muru awladakum bis salati wa hum abna'u sab'in. Instruct, and it would require education. It would require showing them how to do it. Instruct them to perform, instruct your children. Muru awladakum. Instruct your children to perform salah. Instruct them with the salah when they are 7 years old. وَضْرِبُوهُمْ عَلَيْهَا وَهُمْ أَبْنَاءُ عَشْرٍ. And hit them over it when they are 10 years old. وَفَرِّقُوا بَيْنَهُمْ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ. And separate between them in the beds. So firstly, the instruction is addressed to parents in relation to their own children. Instruct your children. It's not in relation to people who have children under their care. That's number one. And number two, no matter how you look at it or interpret it, the hadith could have been general. It could have been general and hit them when they do not obey the law of Allah, for example. But he did not say that. It was specifically in relation to salah. That's number two. it is only in relation to salah and not to nafil. It's in relation to the 5 daily prayers. And we know it's the first that we are going to be asked about and questioned about on the day of Qiyamah. That's number 2. Firstly, it's in relation to children, our own children, parents and their children. And number 2, it's in relation to or pertaining to the 5 daily prayers only. It could have been generally in his statement, but he specified it. And number 3, it's a 3-year period in which you are supposed to instruct them without raising your hand. 3 years from the age of 7, 8, 9. By then, and children are impressionable, and also they follow suit. If you were leading by example, it by then had become part of their day.
Mm-hmm.
By then, they would not know any other way. By then, they would have become acceptable of the fact that this is what I do on a daily basis. So it would be a rare situation where a child, after 3 years of instruction, and you leading him or her by example, at the age of 10, then decides not to. Right? That's number 3. Number 4, this hadith became known amongst the companions, meaning they informed their children that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us and instructed us with this. Likewise, we inform our children, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam instructed us with this. And they, by the age of 10, have reached a level of recognition. Girls may be mukallaf already. Boys are close to mukallaf, close to mature in their understanding. By then, they would have learnt about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They would have developed a certain amount of respect for him and a certain amount of love for him. For them then to understand that this man was so merciful, and this man who was sent as a mercy to the world instructed our parents to hit us over prayer if we refuse to pray at this age. It is supposed to be a deterrent. It is supposed to also cause them to realize that salah is then not something to disregard or to take lightly. Then, 5th now, after understanding it is specifically pertaining to parents and children, it's specifically pertaining to the salah.
Yeah.
It's about the 3 years and not just the child coming in in your class, for example. And I'm not, again, there's nothing to prove that you are allowed to hit a student of Quran or a student of Deen or anyone. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself, if we say we're following his example, Aisha radhiallahu anha said that Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not raise his hand on anyone or anything ever throughout his life. Not even an animal did he hit. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Man la yarham la yurham. Whosoever does not show mercy will not receive mercy. So then the last scholars have commented on this hadith. And they said, if you were to find yourself in a situation where you have come to realize and understand that some other form of discipline is required, and like you say, it's the flick, or like you say, it's the tick or something, right? You should take all the ahadith of dealing with young also into consideration. And it must be darbun, a hit, غير مبرح, that is not drawn from anger. You should be in a clear state of mind. You should be calm. You should not be out of anger, number 1. It should not be in the face. It should not be in any sensitive part of the body. It should not leave any scar or mark, and it should not be repetitive. Now, what type of hit is that? It's merely the skeleton or the outer body of an actual hit, really. And Allah knows best. But people use that hadith as a general reference for hitting students. And we see, if we were to look at even if we were simply to look at it on the surface, it cannot be used. It cannot be used for that cause. And Allah knows best. So the dialogue has begun. And only one scholar thus far has responded to me regarding one of the documents, also giving his input and his opinion, what he has read, etc. And it's important that we start speaking about it more and creating more of an awareness. And social media is powerful. And I have planned, inshallah, in the new year to use it even more efficiently. Inshallah. And to go even more out to more institutions and to create more of an awareness. And that manual, that other resource, I'm excited about it, to try to put it into use, inshallah, as alternatives, so that we can draw and keep the children closer to the book and really develop and nurture that love that they have in their hearts and not push them away and repel them.
Barakallah feekum, very comprehensive, Sheikh. May Allah make that process of yours beneficial, inshallah. So, Dr. Yusuf,
Ameen.
What are the effects of corporal punishment, psychologically and otherwise? And the reason we need to hone into this particular question is you hear people from the elder generation say, yeah, okay, when we grew up, our parents hit us, our teachers hit us, sometimes even extended family members, uncles and aunties, they all use corporal punishment. We didn't like it at the time, but with experience later on, we feel we were the better for it. And they argue that parents and teachers have become very frustrated. Students and children have become very bold, very brazen, very arrogant, because they know that the parent or the teacher is limited when it comes to corporal punishment. From a psychological perspective, how much of an impact does it have? I've heard an argument being made once that, okay, even if there are psychological consequences to corporal punishment, but taking it out of the equation leaves parents and teachers, etc., frustrated. They end up using verbal abuse as a substitute, and that has far greater consequences than physical abuse. What's your thoughts, Doc?
Yeah. Well, let me start again where you had, and Sheikh Ismail had sort of started, and that is by saying that the law is very clear on corporal punishment. So in no way are we proposing defying the law in any form or shape. But I think you raise an important point, and even if it's just for matter of discussion and conversation, I think it's important to consider that. Because I think there are really two extreme positions around corporal punishment. There's the one group that had assumed, I think at the time that corporal punishment was legal, that it was the panacea and the solution to all problems with discipline within schools. And clearly we know it is not the case, because despite the implementation of corporal punishment at the time, we still had disciplinary issues within our schools. The other position, I think, makes the assumption that if you abolish corporal punishment, then all will be well at school. And I mean, clearly, if we look around our school systems today, there doesn't seem to be any indication the total abolition of corporal punishment had sorted out all our problems, and children are all learning and respectful and disciplined, and so on and so forth. So there seemed to be a necessity for us to almost find a middle road. And I think Sheikh Ismail has kind of alluded to a kind of middle road that can be evolved in terms of how we see, as a Muslim community, the notion of corporal punishment in our schools, within our homes, and so on. And so there are certain definite guidelines. And when I look at corporal punishment, I almost look at capital punishment, and I look at war. Those are kind of two other examples where we are allowed to use a certain level of force. And yet there are some prerequisites before we go to war. There must be a settled negotiation. And if you can reach a settled negotiation, then we don't have to go to war. With capital punishment, there's a very similar kind of approach, and that is that if the family of the victim decides to forgive the murderer, and then you can't, I stand under correction, there would be no need to implement capital punishment. You can make an arrangement and settle the blood money, and so on and so forth. So Islam makes a sort of very balanced position on this. And I think in the discussion by Sheikh Ismail Londt, he kind of outlines that. We know, for example, that period between the age of 7 and before we become mukallaf at 7, that's the 7 years in which we are allowed to teach our children, to instruct them. Beyond the age of mukallaf, then it's their responsibility. They bear the burden of the sin of not performing salah. But before that, we do have a particular role to play in enforcing certain things, in demanding certain things of our children. Not everything, and it's quite clear it is about salah. And because salah is so important, that's why we were given the permission to use a level of physical force to make sure that the child conforms. But there is this period of 3 years, and it's quite correct. And so there's always this thing about following the process, following the steps before you get to that position where the enforcement of physical force is necessary. And I think that's probably something we can look at. However, given the fact that corporal punishment has been abolished,
Yeah.
I think we need to stop short of implementing physical force within our schools. I think clearly that is not possible. But there must be a process within our schools clearly outlined to all our teachers as to what are the tools available to them, what are the measures available to them that they can enforce. They're not completely powerless to just watch misconduct or watch underperformance and not being able to do anything. And I think that's the challenge that we have. We need to begin to consult, and we need to begin to develop, and we need to begin to train our teachers about those measures that are clearly sort of part of the Quranic and the Sunnah in terms of leading up to a certain point, and we stop at that point. We don't go further than that point. But we do have certain measures that we can use and that we should be using within our schools.
On that argument that those in previous generations that were the victims of corporal punishment, it disciplined them and they were the better for it. Is that backed up by the science, or psychologically in the main? Does research tell us that those who were on the receiving end of severe corporal punishment were actually psychologically scarred?
Yeah. Look, research around areas like that in the human sciences are always debatable. And I always use anecdotal information. If you ask me what my experiences was at the time then when I grew up, I would tell you there were basically three kinds of teachers that I had experienced. I think the one teacher was the one who commanded respect, conducted himself in a manner that elicited respect from the student. And that kind of teacher never used or didn't have to use any form of corporal punishment. On the other hand, we had a teacher who was frustrated and angry, and those teachers who didn't have any tools except the emotional outbursts would inflict not corporal punishment, but they would inflict physical abuse. And that's the reality. I think in those years, what was construed as corporal punishment was in reality physical abuse. And then, of course, there were these teachers who administered corporal punishment in the manner that assisted you to conform. And if I look back, and I'm sure many people of my generation would say on an individual and a personal level, it did not do us any harm. But for every person who says that corporal punishment did not harm you, there are 10 other people who would allege that because of corporal punishment and the manner in which it was inflicted and the duration of the corporal punishment over a period of time had led to very, very serious psychological and emotional trauma for those people. And a lot of children had dropped out of school, not because they weren't able to learn, but they couldn't keep up with the kind of abuse that was inflicted. So there are these sort of range of opinions on corporal punishment that one can engage in to talk about. But I think for the purposes of tonight, I think it's just simply to say, regardless of that, corporal punishment is prohibited in all areas of public life, and it is our responsibility to ensure that that law is implemented, to ensure that that law is implemented in a fair way, in a clear way, and in a way that allows our schools to maintain a high level of discipline, management within the class and within the school as a whole. And that is a challenging thing. Sure, Ismail will agree with that. It's not easy, but I think we need to begin to start that journey because we can't afford to leave our PIF schools and our independent Islamic schools out of the loop. Because very soon people will get note of the idea that they can report, and then it would be an issue.
Time for a break. Again, when we come back, we continue the discussion on corporal punishment. Welcome back. So on the program today, we're talking about corporal punishment. Our guest, Sheikh Ismail Londt, the head of the Department of Quranic Affairs at the Muslim Judicial Council in Cape Town, and Dr. Yusuf Lalkhen, an educational psychologist. So far, Sheikh Ismail has explained to us the series of statements that he has released addressing the issue of corporal punishment, especially in the religious environment where we do religious studies, be it a Hifz class, be it a maktab. Dr. Yusuf has spoken to us about the definition, the legalities, the psychological effects, the two extremes when it comes to views around corporal punishment. And Sheikh Ismail has also taken us through a very comprehensive perspective on what Islam says and what does the Sunnah say, and how do you interpret some of the ahadith that are generally used when it comes to the debate and the discussion around corporal punishment. So, Sheikh Ismail, when this happens within a religious environment, let's say you're a parent, your kid comes home and says, at the hifz class or at the maktab, my teacher hit me. What would be the best way to address this as a parent, as a principal? Sometimes people get angry, and you can understand that when it comes to your children, they want to report it. Afterwards, there's community criticism saying, okay, the teacher is also a human, you've overreacted somewhat. At times, it may be a neighbor who sees the neighbor, hitting the child, and they say, no, this is not right, this is illegal, this is going to cause harm to the kid. I'm going to report the parent for abusing their child. What would your advice be in terms of those incidents where corporal punishment is reported? What should we be doing, going forward as a community? And is there any position that your department at the MJC has when it comes to how this should be addressed?
Okay, yes, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Even though, Moulana, the Department of Quranic Affairs is an official department of the Muslim Judicial Council, its level of recognition and acknowledgement in the community is yet to be desired and yet to be achieved. Its level of acknowledgement. It is not at the position or at the place yet where it is considered a regulatory body. We would love it to get to that stage, but not yet. We are at a stage where we are presenting ourselves as a support structure and a structure that people can turn to for additional information and guidance. And my aim and intention through the social media platforms and the activities I'm trying to get off the ground in this year and to start afresh within the new year, inshallah, is to ultimately see us as a community of institutions where Quran is being taught, whether it be the hifz institutions or the maktabs, like you said, the madaris, or the academic Islamic institutions or the religious institutions, to see us as a community of institutions working towards a particular standard collectively. We can do so much more if we work together. And as such, when people do come to know of such cases, or rather families bring it to our attention, and like I said, thus far, people have been working independently. And only one family thus far have brought a particular case of this nature to my attention. So we do not have any clear protocol as yet. We do have an education desk that's run by Sheikh Riyad Fatah. And I know in the past he mentioned to me, because I reported this to him. He said there were cases brought to his attention directly before when people came to know he's at the education desk. And all that they could do at that time was two things. They could invite or request the institutional head or the assumed education or a teacher who engaged in the corporal punishment to present himself and to engage with him and to verify the information firstly. And then once it's verified and it's conclusive that he actually did engage in that type of activity, then to advise him accordingly. Beyond that, what is then stated is this: if it comes to the ears of our authorities, you should know that we cannot stand in defense of what you had done. It cannot be. And that is the stance of the council and the stance of the department individual or in particular, that we consider corporal punishment absolutely unacceptable as citizens of this country and as people who have access to religious texts and have come to a particular type of understanding as to how it should be implemented. So currently, if anyone comes to us, all that we can do is awareness, and we verify the information, and we engage with the educators and then trying to aid them to either rectify and not how can I say do acknowledge that what they did was inappropriate, and amend the way in which they are to engage with students in the future. But like I said, we cannot yet regulate what individuals are doing within their institutions. We then simply have to end with saying that if this were to continue, and it does come to the ears of our authorities or the community, you should know that we cannot stand by this.
Absolutely.
Cannot support it.
So, Dr. Yusuf, you spoke earlier on about alternatives. Perhaps you can elaborate on that for us. With corporal punishment out of the equation, teachers, parents, elders, what instruments do they have at their disposal which can be constructively used to instill discipline within children, within students?
Yeah. Again, just to link with what Sheikh Ismail has said, it seems a pity that there is no body that can have influence on these schools and the madrasas and the hifz schools in order to ensure that they don't overstep the mark. And I think in the absence of information, of understanding, of training and support, we are bound to get an increasing number of parents coming forward with complaints regarding the abuse of children within these schools. I think it's almost necessary that we begin that process. In terms of what else to do, well, there's a whole lot of discussion that has taken place over many years. So since the abolition of corporal punishment in 1997, there's been a huge surge of material around what they call positive disciplining. And I would urge Sheikh Ismail and others to get hold of these documents. Some of them are applicable to a mainstream environment, but they could certainly be adapted in some form or shape to be implemented within our schools as well. So it's not that we are completely excluding the idea of no discipline in school, but clearly to begin to empower the teachers and the management of the school with the particular tools of what to do and what not to do. And I would really like to suggest, for example, that in all of these schools that are currently employing teachers, there must be a basic conditions of employment principles that must be employed in that contract with the teachers. And so as a start, I think we should encourage all our schools that when they do employ people is to ensure from a legal perspective that such a document is in place. And one of the elements within that document should clearly stipulate the fact that corporal punishment would not be allowed, and to explain to these employees what that entails. So as a start, I think it is to ensure that there is clarity about what is permitted and what is not permitted. And then, of course, to then provide them with a series of processes as to what they should be doing in terms of reporting these matters to the principal in order for matters to be taken further by the management and the board of the school. And that should be a kind of backup to the teacher. So the teacher would not be expected to enforce everything within the class. There are basic rules around class management that I think any good teacher needs to know that will ensure that there's cooperation from a learner. I think one of the dilemmas we have, obviously, in our hifz schools and our Islamic schools is very often that most of the people employed are not qualified teachers in terms of having gone through a teacher's training program. So they lack the basic skills. And I think that's probably where we should be starting. And that is to provide a kind of basic training in teaching methodology and in classroom management and in child psychology, so that the teachers can understand what it is that they are dealing with. And what seems to be obviously a form of misconduct and inexperienced eye would simply be a child trying to assert his independence, trying to assert his opinion, which we should grant children to do at a particular age. But if you don't know the difference between that and backchatting, then you would be more likely to respond inappropriately to it. So I think in terms of the way forward is to begin to try to understand what the concept of positive discipline is all about. And all of these principles, when I look at it, is clearly in line with what we had already articulated. The Quranic and the Sunnah principles are embedded in that. It's really about respect for the other person and mutual respect and recognition of that, and the manner in which we speak. I mean, these are all prophetic traditions, that be merciful, be accommodating, set firm guidelines, be non-negotiable about certain things. Salah, for example, is non-negotiable.
Yes.
There's no discussion around it. There's no ifs and buts and maybes around it. So within Islam, we have certain non-negotiables, and we have negotiables. If you're ill, then you don't have to fast. It's negotiable. If you're menstruating, then you don't make salah. It's negotiable. But the making of salah is not negotiable. So, we need to, as an Islamic, entity and community, I think we need to come together and begin to construct our interpretation of positive discipline in our schools according to Quran and Sunnah, and then begin to articulate that to our teachers as part of their own upskilling within the organizations.
Sheikh Ismail, we're almost out of time, but if you can conclude by telling us about some plans that you have for next year, and perhaps just your summarizing thoughts.
Alhamdulillah. Dr. Yusuf mentioned, suggested a type of educators program, and we are on the same wavelength. Alhamdulillah, I should meet up with Doctor in Cape Town. The ball has begun to roll, Doctor, and I mentioned Habib Kaji earlier, him and Mariam Sali, and there's a gentleman, Enver Hassan, who you most likely know. We've had two meetings. MashaAllah, we've had meetings thus far, and we are putting a plan together to launch a Quran educators development program. Quran educators development program that will include child psychology, adolescent psychology. It will include personal mental well-being as well. Maybe the teacher is going through things. The teacher needs to have tools to manage him or herself as well. It will even include a basic first aid course because many of the institutions do not have educators who are trained in first aid, safety management and security, basic administrative skills, etc. So we are putting a package together to develop the educators at these private institutions, the Hifd and the Madaris, because Mr. Enver mentioned that the WCED came to acknowledge and realize that they cannot expect the Quran teacher to go through a general education program, because where he or she will ultimately find him or herself in cannot be compared to the academic class. It's a different space, a different class. So they've reached the point where they've come to accept that if we were to design something in consultation with the experts and professionals, if we were to design something that we deem adequate and conducive and appropriate for this space, so as to upskill our teachers to be able to address and deal with their students better, then inshallah, once it's refined, they would then accredit this type of program when they see it in implementation, inshallah. So what we are going to launch at the end of this month is a pilot project that we would love to start in the new year. And I'm opening the floor, inshallah, soon to educators in various institutions to come to a strategy meeting and to get their buy-in and to get their commitment. For it would require of us to present it to them and to engage with them on weekends or during school holidays, or even during week evenings, just to get the standard, inshallah, in place. And as such, inshallah, once we have reached a particular level of competency and produced a group of graduates, Dr. Yusuf and Moulana, the idea would then be to make our community aware of these individuals and institutions that have gone through our program, and as such set a standard and encourage others also to join and participate and be part of it, and ultimately through this process a type of regulation could then take place, inshallah.
Inshallah. Sheikh Ismail and Dr. Yusuf, to both of you, Jazakumullah for your time and very insightful perspectives. May Allah Ta'ala reward you.
Ameen. Jazakumullah wa iyyakum. Allah reward you too greatly. Shukran for this opportunity. May Allah take the station, Hilaal TV, from strength to strength.
Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And a special acknowledgement to Sister Hawa for assisting greatly with putting this program together. Let me conclude by telling our viewers that this is something, like Dr. Yusuf said, don't go to either one of the two extremes. And educate yourself about what the true Islamic perspective is on this issue. And I think Sheikh Ismail has enlightened us quite adequately in that regard. Until next week, inshallah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.